Welcome to the HRLocker podcast. We're back with our first show of 2021 and we've got some great guests lined up ready to chat about remote work, digital transformation, the future of work and all things HR. We're still reeling from the shock of COVID-19 and the effects that it's had across the globe have been devastating. But with new vaccine rollouts happening, hope is on the horizon. Nobody could have possibly forecast that remote working would become a requirement for many businesses in order for them to continue during the pandemic. It's been almost a year and remote working is no longer a new thing. It's now the way we work. A recent HRLocker survey showed that when organisations start to reopen, almost 2/3 of people will not return to the office full-time. The government has now begun to draw up new legislation around remote working and the right to disconnect. Our host today is Crystel Rynne, Chief Marketing Officer at HRLocker, and today's guest is Derek McKay, Managing Director of Adare HRM. Derek is an experienced HR and employment law practitioner. Listen in while they navigate the new employment law updates for Ireland in 2021.
Today we have Derek McKay here from Adare HR. So Derek, welcome to the show. I'm really delighted to have you on today.
Great, thanks, Crystel.
Yes, good. Can you tell the listeners, Derek, a little bit about yourself and what your areas of expertise are?
Great. Yes. Well, look, I've spent the last 20 plus years working in the HR and employment law arena, and the last 17 or so in a consultancy capacity with Adare Human Resource Management. And I think it's fair to say the last kind of 9+ months have certainly created a lot of challenge and opportunity in the world of HR.
Absolutely. And that's one of the areas that I'd kind of like to discuss with you today, Derek, is usually we get these employment law updates and it's just it's a normal update, whereas this year, who knows what's going on? Everything is changing all the time. Yeah. So we're just going to touch base on a few of the things that have been released so far. So one of the things the government have released in 2021 is the right to request remote working. And I suppose my biggest question around that is, haven't we always been able to request remote working?
Well, I suppose you're right in terms of each year there's new legislation comes about and kind of codes of practice as well to help guide employers. But certainly the momentum behind the legislation and potential future acts now has certainly increased. So I think, yes, an employee has always had the right to request part-time working under the code of practice for part-time working. But certainly now, since the government's national remote work strategy has been published, the spotlight is significantly now on the right to request remote working. And I think that those words sometimes have been lost about to request remote working rather than the right to remote working. And I think there's a big difference in terms of that, how employers view it and how employees view it. So certainly now there's going to be, as you can well expect, a lot of momentum now behind the whole area of organizations potentially embracing remote working on a more long-term permanent basis.
But I think that's the key, Derek, isn't it? That you have the right to request it, but you don't have the right automatically to get it. So my understanding is if you request it, the company can reject it, but they need to have a legitimate reason for it. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I think, look, I think it's a healthy dialogue to have between employers and employees. Like ultimately, employers want productive employees. And employees want flexibility, they want to be able to carry out the work. So a lot of the times where it's carried out is not actually the main concern. There's obviously certain sectors that requires, a physical presence, such as manufacturing and certain types of work. I think there's a lot of debate to be had. I know we've been talking, as you can appreciate, with multiple employers over the last number of months and would have our own views in relation to remote working and kind of blended working. But there's, I think, a lot of considerations from obviously a health and safety perspective, consideration from a tax perspective. The whole area about productivity has yet, I think, really fully to be tested as to the effectiveness around that. So we'd always say to an organization, absolutely, there's huge benefits to be gotten if done correctly. But we'd always say to an organization, you don't sleepwalk into a full remote working plan or strategy. Either you look at what the business requirements are and look at the employee preferences, and hopefully there's some good common ground to be gotten right there.
And I think one of the biggest areas that we've seen over the last few months is that obviously remote working was forced upon us, and we didn't have an option for it. And you know, a lot of people who had never remote worked before, the feedback was that they didn't turn off working. So people were working 10, 12-hour days because, you know, so we had a remote working force pre-pandemic. So it is a discipline. You know, you need your space. You need to clock in from whatever it is, 9 to 6 or whatever you're working, and treat it like you're going to the office. And that's one of the things I think that has been of most interest to me, is the right to disconnect, because just because you're working from home doesn't mean you're available 24/7.
Yeah.
Which is a discipline that companies have to respect, I suppose.
Oh, and again, very much so. I think, you know, absolutely the organisation needs to lead out on that discipline. And I suppose even in the context of organisations should be leading out of that, you know, obviously pre-pandemic, in terms of, you know, employees in the office, they were still going home probably with their work phone, which has emails on it. So from that perspective, I think the same principle should apply. Again, I think the spotlight has come on it, and more so again because it is more challenging, as we know, to disconnect when the laptop is potentially still there and it's at home, it's in your kitchen, your front room, wherever people are working from. So both the employer has that, I would say, the obligation to make sure that their working practices and their communication practices support employees, you know, finishing up at the appropriate time and not sending the late emails, etc. But equally, it's an employee discipline not to pick up their phone before they go to bed at night and check an email, or, you know, first thing when they're getting up in the morning before it's time to start their working day. So I think there's learned behaviours for both employers and employees in terms of doing that. And I know obviously they're looking, and the code of practice, or the consultation around the code of practice just closed last Friday with the Workplace Relations Commission in terms of inputting into the code of practice. And there's obviously learnings from other countries like France, Italy, Spain, Belgium, who have already kind of gone down the legislative route around this. So I do think it's a good thing in terms of supporting that real area of the disconnect and obviously employee well-being. But I think a common sense approach to it really needs to be there, that both employers and employees respect.
Right, and I think you're dead right. There is somewhat of an onus. Obviously, look, the onus is on the employer, but there is that personal responsibility from an employee perspective. And even for myself, when we started remote working from March, I had to move into my own office to close the door, or else I was working all day. So you do need to have those disciplines yourself to be, you know, to disconnect yourself. It's to take care of your own welfare, your own mental health.
100%. And I think like both the kind of the remote working, you know, we know it's built on trust. You know, well, the whole employment relationship is built on trust. And I suppose that trust is somewhat probably challenged or stretched when we've moved to this remote working space, because managers are used to, in the main, being around their teams and seeing what's working. So I think it's linked directly to this kind of right to disconnect as well, that a manager's phoning someone at home during the day and there's no answer, and they're assuming potentially are they not working when they could be just having the tea break as they'd normally have if they were in the office, or they're on their lunch, or gone out for a walk during their break, which perfectly
is
entitled
normal
to do. Exactly. And what us HR people have been, I suppose, pushing the health and well-being agenda to make sure people do get up from their desks, because sitting down 7-8 hours a day, as we know, isn't what us humans are designed for. So I think it is absolutely linked back to the whole area of the remote work strategy. But what I wouldn't like to see is us over legislating in terms of every time an employee has a particular concern, we end up in a third party, or we end up in dispute. There's enough claims in the Workplace Relations Commission and the Labour Court as there is, and it's been growing for years. And looking through an employer's lens, we'd hate to see that this is just going to create a whole new burden of pressure on employers. I think if everyone goes into it with the same intention of it's a two-way street, that employers and employees can benefit if this is done correctly, then everyone wins. But inevitably, there's going to be times when, the employer's preference or the employer's needs don't match the employee's preferences.
Because that's the other area I was surprised to see about the health and safety policy for home workers and the duty of care for employers. Because I suppose reading that, I was thinking, it's a bit of a minefield. How are employers going to make sure that my remote setup is ergonomical? How do you do that as an employer?
Yeah, well, that I suppose is where a lot of employers rushed to last year, and I, in the same way, tasked our health and safety team to say, how can we support our clients in this particular area in terms of DSE and ergonomics? And I think initially the goodwill between employers, employees, unions, everyone during the pandemic was needs must. So let's just get working in a new setup. And as time moves forward and moves on, then the expectations about obligations and legislation kind of really do kick back in. And the Health and Safety Authority would have updated their guidelines in late 2020. And to be fair, some very good stuff on the HSA website. But from an employer's perspective, really does mean that you have two places of work for employees. You have, if you still have your offices wherever they may be, that employees may be required to attend at certain days, and people have home working. The obligations is on both. But a very practical approach from a health and safety perspective is required, that, it isn't the employer's obligation to carry out a health and safety assessment of the house. We are talking about the workspace that an employee has. And we talk about ergonomics, we're talking about, hopefully the screen that is at eye level. We're talking about providing a keyboard, if they're working off a laptop. And very practical considerations, rather than what some organizations would have feared they would have to do, is nearly remodel part of the house on behalf.
Build an outside office.
Well, this is it. I tell you, the bills will be going up. But I think it's important as well that employees, they need to find a suitable place of work in their house. And we have to be honest, not every employee has that. They don't have the separate room. They don't have potentially the separate desk. And for SMEs in particular, that is going to become a cost. I think some of the multinationals, it's not as big a challenge, but for SMEs, there's potential costs down there as well. And we're yet to see the impact of, we have to be honest about personal injury claims, that may come about by people feeling that they haven't been given the proper chair, they haven't been ergonomically assessed in their home environment, as they would have been if they were in their office environment.
Yeah, and that's where I see is, and look, I'm a huge advocate of remote working, and I think it's here to stay in whatever shape or form, whether it's dual working or a combination or whatever it is. But I do wonder, is the idea of, okay, so if I have 50 remote workers, do I have to supply 50 desks and 50 chairs? Well, actually double, because they're working in the office. So do I have to supply 100 desks and 100 chairs and 100 risers and 100 screens instead? Then, and like you said, I think sometimes we get into this silly world of legalities and suits and things like that, and then they become blockers. So I think a little bit of common sense sometimes.
And I think we haven't landed where it's going to land. I think in this whole area. Look, in an ideal world, absolutely, every employee would have, the same setup mirrored at home. But again, if you think about the organizations where, even if they've high employee turnover, even getting all the equipment and stuff back from an employee. So these are very practical terms. But I think, look, the obligation of health and safety is there on employers. So, we can't ignore that. But within the legislation, employees have a duty of care as well, to be communicating with their manager or with their health and safety rep, to find, as well as, and make sure that they have a suitable work space allocated, that is, again, ergonomically suitable for the work, that they're doing. And, they mightn't have the landline, but you could have maybe a different sort of setup in terms of technology. So technology's come on, and as we know, the last number of months, leaps and bounds to support remote working. But again, this is where I think this approach where, organizations looking at remote working, or they're looking at the right to disconnect, they're looking at health and safety, they're looking at GDPR, they're looking at all the aspects.
The bigger picture, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And we're getting, as time moves on, and look, thankfully, the vaccine rollout has commenced, but as time moves on, organizations are going to have to make informed decisions, because the expectation is there. I would see, we're hearing it widely from employees, that they're not expecting to go back into the office. Now, whether they're expecting to go back in sometimes or some days, but certainly a more blended, flexible approach, the expectation is there. I'm not hearing that as much from employers in terms of organizations, and we haven't yet made that decision, because it is a longer term decision than the current state, which is we're doing it because we have to, from a pandemic and health and safety perspective. But HR people, organizations are going to have to, over the coming weeks and months, quickly, I suppose, make that decision as to what they're going to be doing. And I think on the other side is, with my HR hat on, organizations have spent a lot of time building up their employee value proposition, and they've spent a lot of time on culture and other aspects. It's a different way if half your workforce are remote, half your workforce are in the office, or they're passing by each other throughout the week in terms of different days. Working on culture, working on things like that, it's going to take a whole new set of tools, I think, from a HR perspective, and that heretofore probably aren't being used as effectively.
And I would definitely agree with that, is that in terms of if you do have remote teams, which we've always had, is that culture is even more important, because it's a different way of doing, because you're not all in the same room. You're not walking past each other. You have to really, really try and really make an effort with it. And that's probably something that's new for a lot of HR people and a lot of HR managers, because they've never had to.
Yeah. Well, I think it's and HR managers, but managers, where managers are used to having their 5, 10, 20 people around them on the team, where they can tap them on the shoulder, they can go through something on the screen with them. And look, technology is allowing us to do that as well. But I think particularly like that onboarding process for new people coming in, those informal discussions, the catch up, all these things have to be taken into account in a more virtual, remote world. And it is possible. Look, we know that. We know many of organizations have done it successfully. But equally, they've usually done so in a planned way, or they've done so through trial and error. And hopefully they've come out the other side of the learning. So we'd be encouraging any organization to scenario all the different aspects that do need to be covered, and absolutely acknowledging, look, there's huge benefits for quality of life if you don't have to travel an hour each way in the morning times, or whatever it might be. No one kind of really loves the traffic element of it, but equally the collaboration that happens when you're naturally around your colleagues, as someone calls it, the water cooler chats, the informal things of relationship building, they're things that have always happened in the workplace because we've been around each other. In the absence of that, we have to work a lot harder from a HR perspective to make sure that doesn't get lost, or as I call it, the cultural erosion doesn't happen, that all of a sudden we don't know who we are because we are just so spread out all across the country, and people aren't interacting as much as they would be if they were in the same physical space.
I wonder, and I'll take this analogy that obviously, as I said, we at HRLocker, we're a remote team. We've always had remote workers. So when pandemic hit, we just went home and we went to our workspaces, and it was just business as usual, because we knew how to do it, and we know, and we already have all those things in place. Everybody gets the same table and same laptop and same risers and all that kind of thing. But then at the same time, what I'm comparing it to is companies who have never had any remote working, and I'm obviously homeschooling at the moment, which is going terribly. So I'm wondering which obviously people do homeschool and that works for them. So, but I had no plan. So, so I think the plan is the important bit.
Oh, well, look, all I know is I would not make a good teacher. I can openly admit my skill set in that area. I'm hoping my HR skill set is good, but I know my ability to be a teacher has been called into question. But equally, again, if we think of where we are now in January, and unfortunately into February and maybe longer, similar to where we were last March and April, the homeschooling, the home working element is in place because, as I said, it's been thrust upon us necessarily from pandemic and health and safety perspective. And there's that dual role, as you said, for a number of households in terms of homeschooling. And as we know, home working isn't a substitute for creches, for schools and all that side of things. And again, I think because employers and employees haven't had a run at this new model without all these other nuances.
When it's normal. Normality.
Yeah. I'd love to hear the word normal, exactly. So if things were normal, the employers would have planned this. They would have had the input from, employee representatives, from HR, from legal, from health and safety. They would have had the flexibility in terms of their own routine at home, children going to school, going to creche, whatever it might be. And yes, we would have a better understanding of how it may operate as most effectively. And hopefully we're going to get to those discussions in the near future. And they will need to be had. But I think, again, from talking, I'm involved in a lot of different HR forums and talking with different HR leaders. And the conversation really is about, think about all the scenarios. What does the organization need? And where can they be flexible? Where are the benefits? And trying to meet employees along that journey. But equally, and an interesting conversation I've had where, the employee value proposition I referenced earlier is now, if I'm seeking to change jobs, no longer do I necessarily need to live anywhere near where I worked. So I could live in Clare and get a salary that's a Dublin-based salary or wherever I wish to live. So it opens up the job market as well, and HR and employers need to be kind of aware of that the talent that they've so badly sought to acquire and retain might be more difficult to retain in the future if they're not offering a level of flexibility comparable to what's out there in the market for their staff.
Yeah, and I definitely think that that's one of the things over the next 12 months that's going to really affect the job market. Like I said, we're based in Clare, so the guys here who previously wanted to work in Clare or work in Limerick or work in Cork, they don't have those boundaries anymore. They can work. They can work for Google in Dublin. They don't have to.
Yeah.
So I definitely think you're going to see a huge impact on the job market. But then I also wonder, so we're in this kind of bubble at the moment that we're accepting people are working from home, and maybe I hire somebody who's in a different county to me, but you do have to be mindful that person definitely is not coming to the office then. So it's a permanent.
Well, you're touching upon it there. Obviously I look through the employment law lens and what the contract states and where your place of work is. And employers, again, need to, is it that the place of work is still the office, but they are allowing flexible working, remote working for 3 days a week? Or, what is it that the employer is looking to achieve
long term?
And I haven't heard of too many organizations that have we're closing our office and we're going remote, because they're not. I don't think they're there yet.
Not 100%.
No, not 100%. You can't forget, people are, in the main, a lot of people are used to going to their place of work, and managers are used to that. Their bosses are used to that, and it's going to take, and it has been speeded up, we know, significantly, but it's going to still take some, I think, mindset shift for organizations in terms of if they're going down a different way of working in terms of what they're offering, how they're going to support their employees in that new arena. Because we're hearing a lot, obviously, around some of the well-being and the health challenges from people. Obviously, some of that is pandemic related. Some of that is the pressure of being a parent and the homeschooling element of it. But I wouldn't underestimate the value of the impact of not having your colleagues around you in terms of the chat, the supports, the going for a walk at lunchtime or having a sandwich with someone there versus it being by yourself. And we've all used Zoom and Teams, but already, Zoom fatigue has been referenced months ago. Yeah. So, fast forward 12 months, where are people going to be at in terms of their engagement levels with an organization and that cultural piece? So there's still a lot to be ironed out. Yeah. But again, definitely opportunities within there. But, as I say, work through the key considerations from an employer's perspective and be mindful of what the legislation and or the codes of practice are going to be governing these areas.
Yeah, I think you are right, is that, for that employee engagement side of it and the cultural side of it, from a HR perspective, it's just ramping it up. It's just finding different ways how to do it while we're all remote, and if you're going to continue with remote, figure out how you're going to do it remotely. It's a different thing.
Well, I just think about my time in the multinationals and things like the sports and social club. You'd be on part of the football team or you'd be on these different events. And that was natural because, that's what people did. If that whole company was working from home, that they would have to approach that completely differently. And you just wonder, by the time someone's on board, how engaged they would be in terms of attending events if they haven't been engaging long-term with that. But this is all to be seen. I know there's obviously several different case studies and different organizations who've done it, but equally, and I know even in the most recent the government, the national strategy, it does acknowledge that some of the feedback is mixed in terms of things like productivity and the rest. So it doesn't suit every organization, it doesn't suit every individual, but it certainly can work well if approached in the right way.
And I think that's the key. There's positive and negative, so you just have to weigh them up.
Absolutely, yeah.
One of the things, Derek, all companies were there's so many issues going on, with the pandemic, working from home, things like that, lockdowns. And I suppose the two areas that I would be seeing is going to affect companies a lot in the next couple of months is one, the PUP scheme obviously ending, but who knows is it going to end? I mean, they're scheduled to be the end of March. And then as well, the consultation around statutory sick pay, which both I think are going to really affect employers' bottom line. So, I mean, in terms of the PUP, do you think it's going to end at the end of March?
I can't see how they can.
Yeah.
No, not unfortunately with the current trajectory and the timing of the vaccine. So you could certainly imagine, Q2 into Q3 with the PUP payments, and then maybe looking on a more kind of sectoral basis, whereby obviously there's certain sectors, as we well know, that
tourism or something,
tourism and places, that really have been negatively affected. But I think from an economic perspective and even the health perspective, I think the government won't, because it will bring about a raft of potential redundancies as well, because we know the Redundancy Payments Act had been temporarily amended in terms of preventing, I suppose, employees triggering redundancies. And we know, in terms of keeping people in employment is healthy, both economic-wise and for individuals as well. So I think, it'll definitely, well, I can't say definitely, but the high expectations it will continue on for in this another quarter. Yeah,
I would agree. And that's what I would see if they enter the PUP at the end of March. Are they just going to be mass redundancies?
Yeah. It's just going to be the same or greater cost for government, because unemployment benefits start to go out, spend, in terms of individual or personal spend goes down. That's what contracts in terms from contracts, the economic side of things. So look, it will have to stop at some stage. The government have been inputting significant monies, as we know, to keep viable businesses going. And we haven't yet seen, like I think back in 08, 09, that time frame, like the sheer number of redundancies we would be managed on collective and individual basis, whilst we're involved in numerous ones at the moment, nowhere near the scale we would have been back in the financial crisis of 08, 09, but we would expect it to increase this year as organizations kind of look forward and plan forward to say, like, yes, if the PUP scheme finishes in Q2, Q3, is there still going to be enough business out there? Is the economy going to be strong enough?
We have to put the plug at some point. Yeah,
absolutely. And organizations making informed decisions as to what is the level of headcount or resource they can manage with the level of demand for their services. So look, there will be, I think, unfortunately, be an impact on the real unemployment rate later on this year.
Yeah, which I think exactly, I would agree that we'll see at the end of this year rather than imminently,
Yes, yeah.
The other thing, which I mean, I've just been briefly looking at myself, is the sick pay statutory consultation. So my understanding is it's just going through consultation, or it's finished at the end of December. I mean, that's another it's a huge cost.
It is, and I know we're kind of, we're one of only like a small 2 or 3 countries in terms of EU members who doesn't have the statutory sick pay in place. And I think, look, in general terms, no one wants to see an employee who's out on genuine sick leave be at a financial disadvantage. From a human perspective, a HR perspective, absolutely. I think the timing obviously is a challenge. That I think any particularly SME or certain sectors, this isn't a welcome discussion at this moment in time in terms of potential new cost for employers. I suppose that the devil will be in the detail in terms of, is it going to be just for a couple of weeks that the employer would be required to subsidise an employee? At what level would they be required, to subsidise the salary at? To be fair, look, a lot of organisations do have some element of sick pay. It can be a week, can be 2 weeks, at full pay. As some of the large organisations obviously have much more generous sick pay schemes, but we know to certain sectors that sick pay isn't a feature, and particularly the lower paid sectors as well, and where margins are tight. So yeah, I think the timing, if we were talking about this, 12 months ago, 18 months ago, it probably would go through probably quite quicker with less pushback. But I think the SMEs at the moment, this won't be a welcomed development.
I feel like that, yeah, they're just looking at it going, this is another expense. But on the other flip side, it's actually bringing us into line with the rest of the EU. So
no, like it is. And I think, and I know even employers that don't have their sick pay scheme written down, and they mightn't have an official sick pay scheme, but they might well pay someone if they've been out for a few days, because there's that loyalty there that employees unwell and genuinely sick, the employer's not out to penalise an employee for being sick.
Most people are good people.
They are, and you work off that. And I say to employers that you never change a sick pay policy because of a few people that may misuse the policy or take advantage of the pay element, because you get back in spades in terms of engagement and supporting an employee when they're genuinely absent, from work. I do think, we need to make sure that, the occupational health side, that, that GPs are asking the right questions of employees, because it's healthy for an employee to be in a good place of work and to be engaged with their employer. So I think, look, it's going to happen. It's going to happen later this year. It's just a case of what format it's going to take from an employer. But I think it's from most employers' perspective, they're looking forward in terms of COVID and the economy. This is the sick pay element of statutory sick pay will just really probably just be thrust upon them when it
and I think
happens.
That's just bad timing, but it's just
it is look, and it's probably not getting much coverage in many employers' minds because they're saying, look, that isn't the issue that's high in my agenda at the moment. They're focused on hopefully recovery, hopefully bounce back, or managing their current cost base as effectively as they can. And they're probably more worried about the PUP scheme than the statutory sick pay, definitely.
So one of the things we touched on briefly, Derek, is, usually HR is kind of like the hub of the organizations, and it's the place where you're going to knock on the door and go in and have a chat with your HR manager about maybe some tears. It's so for HR managers who now have mostly a remote workforce, going forward, who will probably have some form of remote workforce, how does HR continue to kind of have that, continue with that empathy and even if it's going to be online, or how do you have that rapport? Because, yes, I think that most companies are not going to go 100% remote, but there is always going to be that element. So, HR has to involve to be able to understand how to do those things online.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I think, just tweaking your existing HR policies or practices isn't going to work. I don't think I know there's a lot of language around the future of work, and I'm reluctant to even say it on on this podcast, but because the future of work is now, it's what's happening now, and in the coming months is where we're landing. We're not talking 3 years' time. So tweaking a HR policy is not going to be sufficient enough. So I think HR absolutely need to take a step back and look at now that the old way of engaging, the old way of performance management, the old way of onboarding, all those, the old way of communicating, as you said, building rapport with new staff, supporting employees who, as you said, they potentially would normally sit down and have a conversation, or the employee could knock on the door and come in. And and as you said, that empathy, that rapport. And are employees going to be as willing to organise an MS Teams call with the HR manager and book it in for 2:00 on a Thursday afternoon versus I'm going to walk up an open door policy that's always been referenced in any HR manual you'll ever read, and being able to walk into the HR and saying, can I have a quick word? That informal aspect, where my experience is HR will say, absolutely, come on in. And,
absolutely. And that's a key for it's been the key for HR managers for, years, decades. So I think it's going to be a challenge.
It is. And do we have all the answers now? Absolutely not. Because, what HR can't do now is hide away behind screens and, be behind the keyboard and things like that. So they need, and I spoke to one HR director, and now it would be in an organization with about 40 staff, and they had spent their time phoning every single person, during one of the earlier lockdowns. Even though they could just have sent out a survey and, doing the return to work survey and do all that. They said, we were doing that as well to gather the information, but they got more information from the discussion with the person because they're hearing a little bit more and people more open to having that conversation. They said, as if it was in the office and they were sitting around, discussing it, because the informal nature of discussions saying, and to their surprise, that sometimes people are saying, well, actually, they're very honest saying, I'm just struggling with the kids thing, or you know what, I'm struggling that I don't get to, get out of the house as much as I used to. And that divide, as we talked about, the right to disconnect, that divide between work and home life has become blurred. And so I thought that was a positive, that they could have just sent out the survey, but they followed up on calls for every single person. I think that's the sort of initiative you need. I know it's not possible, you have 200, 300 employees, for organizations, but they do need to make that additional effort. And the other one, it's not just HR people, it's managers, that out of sight isn't out of mind, that if I don't hear from someone on my team, presume that they're doing okay. They should be checking in, and not in a Big Brother format, but in the, how are you getting on today? How's things been? And the employee understanding it's out of that rapport and empathy and wanting to know, rather than I'm checking to see, are you sitting at your laptop?
Yeah, but it is up to the manager, because I don't think HR can do it by themselves, right? So I think it is up to managers to be able to understand the importance of reaching out to their employees to see how they're doing.
Yeah, and I think understanding, I suppose, and I think employees should be open about these things, because sometimes you have two parents working at home, or like that, to saying, well, is it okay now? And this is the whole idea on flexible working, is it's not that we just change location and do our 9 to 5 at our home desk. It is that it's about getting the balance right. And if there's going to be a pickup at 3:00 and 20 minutes, and I wish to do it now going forward, etc., and there's a bit of change in how people have arranged other elements of their lives outside of work, that's what they should engage with the employer, and not be trying to get out and do it and hope the employer doesn't notice. I would be saying, have the discussion. If that's part of the flexible practices that you're doing, the employee's working till 5:20, 5:30. What
exactly, it's no problem.
Being affected. and this whole, and that's what I talked about earlier, that the practices around performance management need to change, because it's not just about, it's about getting the work done, not about necessarily putting the hours in. And that's always been the case, but performance management has never necessarily effectively done that in a lot of organizations. And this is the changing landscape for employers and employees. So employees need to trust their employer to tell them that, and employers need to trust the employees that that's what they're doing. They're going off, and that's going to keep them engaged. That's going to keep them saying, great, that's something now I can do that I couldn't do before. And as long as, if they're working in a call center and that phone needs to be answered and things like that, you can understand flexibility isn't there potentially. But that isn't every organization, far from it. And this is where we can talk about earlier, that dialogue between employers and employees in terms of preferences and what can be accommodated. But there needs to be as well, I suppose, a consistency though within the organization, that managers aren't, I suppose, having completely different practices in one department versus the other. Because look, that's how employment disputes and grievances arise. That I feel my manager is treating me less favorable than the manager in the other team. And that's not what HR folk are looking for, is more grievances or disputes to come across their desk.
But I think that is the key, is that you're, to really steal a word, you're empowering your employees to be able to have that connection with you, you know, that rapport as well. But likewise for you, and the only way that they're going to learn that you're open to these things is by reaching out, which I do understand HR people are busy. It's a busy day's work, but to try to figure out how to engage with people is really going to be a challenge, I think, for the next 12 months, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, engaged, productive employees will always be that. If you've supported that, doesn't matter whether they're working at home, in a hotel lobby, or they're in the office, they're always doing the job. They're always going to get it done, and you make sure that you're not getting in their way. You're supporting them, you're encouraging them, you're giving them the flexibility, and that's where the perfect two-way street is.
Because you want to keep them. You know, you want them to stay.
You want more of them. That's the people you want on your team. And I know, sure, when we do performance management training within organizations, obviously virtually at the moment, but you know, when you're doing exercises and you're talking about performance management, a lot of the time the discussions go into poor performance rather than the highly engaged, because the poor performer inevitably takes up more of your time, more of your headspace, and more HR's time. And you're saying, well, how can we make sure we're actually giving the engaged employees and the high performing employees as much of our time, and making sure that we're not forgetting about them just because we don't see them in the office as much as we normally did. That level of feedback. And that's another thing, I suppose, again, in the virtual world, that, you know, giving feedback needs to be planned as well. That, you know, if you might say it in the open plan office, or thank someone, or go over to them and give them the thank you, you're thinking, oh, I'd have to call them up and specifically have a 30-second call with a thank you, and you may be less inclined to do so. So on the engagement front, managers and HR have to work harder on it.
That is a good point, because a lot of the time you just walk past somebody and I'd be like, hey, Derek, thanks a million for that. That was really helpful. Really appreciate that. Whereas now you have to go out of your way to do it. So it is a challenge.
I suppose it's something like going to the gym. If you have to go out of your way to go to the gym, you'll find an excuse to go, oh, sure, look, I'll do it tomorrow. And like, so, and this is where I said the current, when I call the current, kind of the pre-pandemic HR policies and practices nearly need to be kind of parked and start potentially with an open blank page and say, well, what practices do we need to support this, if we are going in this new environment, new blended way of working, and how can we get it right, that the policies aren't too restrictive. But equally, look, employers have to protect themselves.
Yeah, but they're also clear. Exactly,
Yeah, like health and safety we talked about, you know, earlier, as you talked about the right to request remote working. You know, absolutely, you know, there's going to be grievances, there's going to be third-party claims arising out of people being refused what they're looking for. And look, that's going to feed into, unfortunately, the work that we do, and that's going to be coming down the line, and there'll be cases, and you learn from the cases that went through beforehand. But it is going to fuel, unfortunately, part of the third party disputes that are going to arise.
The good with the bad, I suppose.
Absolutely. So organizations will seek to protect themselves in a good way, but hopefully not pull down the shutters fully to say, well, look, we're not going to trust our employees. We know that it's not going to suit everyone, and every scenario isn't going to work. But there's plenty of opportunities, I've said to employers now as well. You can pilot things as well. You can trial it to see, is it working? What's not working? Take some of the lessons from what's not working as well as you'd like, and then and tweak it. So there's opportunity for employers to pilot things as well.
So one of the things, Derek, actually was a customer of ours who pointed me to Linea, which is one of the employment law. So Uptype is a forum that you guys do, which I think is super for customers who are just looking for, you know, what changes are coming up forward. What do I need to know? Question that I get all the time is, how many bank holidays do I pay my part-time staff?
Yes.
So just tell me about Linea. It's an employment law, online employment law application, or you put it in your own words.
Yeah, we developed Linea a number of years ago to be the most kind of comprehensive online resource dedicated for HR practitioners. That there's no shortage of information. We know there's no shortage of requirements for HR people. So what we've developed is a hub aimed at HR practitioners, and it covers all aspects of employment law, industrial relations, health and safety, and best practice human resource management. So it's got all the content in there, and it has everything from tools, templates, to checklists to support HR practitioners. It's got case law from the learnings around each and every particular area of the employment relationship. So it's built on the employment life cycle. So kind of before, during, and terminating employment. So there's a huge amount of information on it. And even since so it's mid-March, our developments on Linea have been significant. We developed a specific COVID hub, which is updated non-stop, as you can appreciate, with everything from the different wage subsidy schemes through to all the different changes. So that's been huge. We developed a health and wellbeing hub as well, again, to support HR people, to support their organizations. And there's a huge amount of information, videos, toolkits, etc. on that. And our communications are going out weekly, out via Linea to HR practitioners. So it's on our website. It's accessible through adarehrm.ie. And you'll see a Linea tab under our services. And you can have a trial of it. There's a video demo there as well. And sure, have a look at it, and sure, click the contact us, and you can talk to one of the team about that or other advices that we do.
Thanks a million, Derek. That's been so helpful. And at the bottom of this podcast, we'll have all your contact details if anybody would like to get in contact with you. But I do hope people found that informative. And I definitely think the next 12 months for HR is going to be an interesting time. So thanks so much.
No doubt about it. Look, pleasure talking to you, and I'm sure we'll have plenty more to talk about as the year progresses. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks now. Take care.
Thanks for listening. Check us out at HRLocker.com. The show was hosted by Crystel Rynne and produced by Jenny Martin. Subscribe to catch the latest episodes on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you like to get your podcasts. If you'd like to feature, get in touch by emailing us at marketing@HRLocker.com. You can also follow HRLocker on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn.